Hello, this is Newscast, the BBC's daily news podcast, and that means we've experienced everything that has happened in the UK and the world this year. So I got together with two of my best podcasting buddies to just talk about some of the themes that we have all lived through in 2024. Hello, Laura.
Hello, Adam.
Hello, Chris.
Hello, Adam.
Everyone's being very theatrical. Are we at the pad? It's behind you.
No, you're not.
Well, you know what's behind us. A very momentous
2024.
year. Do you know what's an interesting way of joining the dots from then to now?
Yeah.
Is actually if you just look at who the main leaders in the UK were at the start of the year and who they are now. So the Prime Minister was Rishi Sunak, the First Minister of Wales was Mark Drakeford, the First Minister of Scotland was Humza Yousaf, and Northern Ireland didn't have a First Minister or Deputy First Minister because they were still in that stasis.
And now, Christmas quiz points, Adam, First Minister in Wales.
Ellen Ed Morgan, Baroness Morgan.
Stormont.
Michelle O'Neill is the First Minister, and Emma Little Pengelly is the Deputy First Minister.
Well, you've done the hard ones. And then, Chris, who's in number 10?
we forgot about John Swinney.
Yeah.
She was coming to that.
Oh, right.
We're not
That's
game
not a hard
shows.
one. Because the hard one, the harder ones.
The harder ones, making
not
sure.
for lots of
Laura won
Newcasters
Interviewer of the Year, not Quiz Show
I
Host
know.
of the Year. Would you ever do a quiz show, by the way? I think you'd be good at a quiz show.
Oh, I don't know.
Anyway,
Maybe.
right, okay. So that was the year that was. I suppose the first few months of 2024 was dominated about speculation about whether there was going to be an election or not. And there's an extra episode of Newscast coming your way where we'll talk about the election. But it was
In a lot of detail.
in a lot of
lots of
detail.
detail.
Some might say too much detail. But you could always fast forward those bits. It did take kind of a lot of the oxygen out of other politics.
It did, and it's worth sort of pondering. I mean, I know this was at the outer edges of possibility all along, but as you're listening or watching Newscast right now, it was possible a year ago, and conversations were had a year ago, less than a year ago, that it might still not have happened. Because the absolute legal backstop was the tail end of January of 2025. Now, few thought they would run the clock right down to the end, but most folk this time last year, as we were heading into 2024, thought it was more likely in the autumn than at any other time. And so, yeah, we headed into the year with this sort of sense of when it might be. And then the Prime Minister, as was Rishi Sunak, with that curious formulation about his working assumption. I remember saying at the time, hang on a minute, you have working assumptions about other people's decisions. Not
your
about
call, mate.
It felt very
not
like
about your
nothing
own.
to do with me, even
His
though it was
working
entirely to do with
assumption
him.
that it would be in the second half of the year, which was a promise kept.
Just.
Yeah.
Because it was the 4th of July, so only just the second half of the year. I mean, there was still politics happening, and actually a lot of the politics that was happening kind of electorally was a sign that the political map was going to be a little bit more complicated than it had been in previous decades. So like George Galloway winning the Rochdale by-election after Labour had some problem with their candidate, and then they sort of decided that he wasn't really a Labour candidate anymore, but still was.
And that's actually was one of the ways in which we saw one of the huge realities about 2024 was that foreign policy was dominant in a way that it's not normally in this country. Like, rightly or wrongly, our kind of domestic politics isn't very often shaped by what's going on around the world. What happened in Gaza absolutely had a profound effect on Labour politics in particular, but also the continuing conflicts in Ukraine, other events that have happened in the Middle East. At the back end of 2024, Trump on his way back to the White House, and we've talked so much, haven't we, you guys in the week and Paddy and me at the weekends, we've talked so much about foreign policy because the different conflagrations, shifting alliances, all the tensions have been happening at kind of breakneck speed, and international affairs has had such a projected onto UK politics in a way that it just doesn't normally. And one of the things that really I've kind of returned to again and again this year is an interview we did early on with Jens Stoltenberg, who was the head of the Defence Alliance NATO, where he said, look, everyone and I'm paraphrasing, but everyone basically needs to understand that there is an authoritarian alliance between countries like Russia, Iran, North Korea. We all need to understand that in different ways in the 2020s, they're working together. Western countries need to get their heads around that. And that's been sort of just behind a lot of the issues that our politicians have had to deal with, whether it's energy prices or whether it's Gaza playing out in Labour campaigns and Labour MPs losing their seats or just about losing their seats at the election because of unhappiness over the leadership's position.
And an ongoing political discussion about defence spending.
Right,
I remember
exactly.
one of the last trips that Rishi Sunak did as Prime Minister, and with hindsight was effectively a pre-election trip, which was a trip to Poland and then to Germany over a couple of days. And I was on the plane with him, and I was reminded of it because you mentioned Jens Stoltenberg, the now former head of NATO, because the two of them did an event at a Polish military base surrounded by tanks. In fact, I remember trying to edit our piece for the 6 o'clock news in what was effectively a tank car park with these things doing 3-point turns behind us. And little secret, tanks are quite noisy, even when they're just moving about, let alone doing
Keep it down, chaps.
yeah, let alone doing the firing stuff. Yeah, but that question about what is in the 2020s, in the world that the UK now looks out on, what is an adequate or sufficient amount of money to spend on defence? And that's a very live argument right now.
And not to turn this into a Jens Stoltenberg fan podcast, although I would listen to that, actually. He's an interesting chap. He was, once he left that job as being the Secretary General of NATO, he was one of the very high-profile people saying the Ukraine conflict will have to end with some negotiations, basically bringing out into public what lots of people have been saying in private, that you can't just keep fighting forever and ever and ever.
And that's one of the
and
things
that's moved that conversation on quite a long way.
Yeah, and obviously the Trump return to the White House has suddenly meant that all sorts of people who might have just about whispered that quietly are now saying quite openly. And I remember someone said to me a couple of weeks ago, we talked about it at the weekend, there's a negotiation coming. Everyone knows there's a negotiation coming. So now it's about the Western allies trying to put Zelensky in the strongest possible position for that negotiation. But the great unanswerable, and we'll know before too long, is what Trump is going to put on the table. And the concern in some circles is that it might be a lot of stick for Ukraine and a lot of carrot to Russia in order to bring it to a close. But that, in whatever way, is going to be a defining situation in 2025.
I was talking to someone in his circle, in the Trump circle, just the other week, who was saying that the speed with which that will come, we shouldn't be surprised by. It'll be very, very quick. So they say.
But it also explains, because do you remember that surprise moment when Ukraine invaded Russia in reverse and occupied the Kursk region,
yeah.
And then all the observers were saying, well, no, this is to give them a bargaining chip for something they can give to Russia, for Russia to give something to them in the negotiations. And this is becoming quite an international episode, because I'm then thinking that actually we spent a lot of our time in the first 3 or 4 months of the year before the election was talking about the Rwanda policy. Do you remember?
Yeah.
It's like, talk about like a sort of time capsule and also proof of just how a change of government means the conversation changes utterly. And because with Rwanda, the government announced it, they'd done the deal with Rwanda, then it got held up in the courts, then they had to pass this legislation to get Parliament to say that Rwanda was a safe place to send people so they could be put into the Rwandan asylum system. That took up a lot of time and energy.
It did. I went on a trip to Kigali with James Cleverly, who was kind of an inheritor,
The Home Secretary at the time.
Indeed,
Yeah.
inheritor of the policy, as they were attempting to make it work up against the clock of an election coming and the prospect that it would carry on getting gummed up. But with an argument, and this argument obviously continues now, about if you were seeing a situation where thousands and thousands are crossing the channel and current mechanisms to try and prevent that are not working, do you need a deterrent? And that remains a live argument. Of course, they never got to the point that they were able to actually make it happen. And some of the conversation that goes on around when the election was called, one of the factors some raise is, was it just going to run into the ground? Was it going to be proven within the time frame of an election in this outgoing calendar year that they couldn't make it fly, excuse the pun, and therefore go for an election whilst that's still a hypothetical
possibility?
Exactly.
Call the election. Someone joked, call the election on the tarmac with the first plane about to take off and behind you. Whether the plane actually ever did take off, but if you could get one plane to go. That could have changed that dynamic for the Tories, but there was huge nerves about that. And immigration is, it's still a massive issue. It was this in 2024. Again, the records were broken in terms of the numbers of people coming here illegally. That, of course, sits alongside the issue about illegal crossings and the small boat crossings and terrible loss of life in the Channel. And there's huge pressure on Labour in their first months of government to show how they're actually going to be able to make a dent in that. And by not having made immigration one of their very publicly stated milestones.
Not a milestone, but a foundation.
You know, I think there is a sense in some circles that Labour they've left that open. They've left it open. They've left it open either for the Tories if they kind of get themselves together. Kemi Badenoch, a lot of people are in the Conservative Party think she's been pretty quiet so far and hasn't kind of gripped things by the scruff of the neck. But if not for her, they're leaving a vacuum for Nigel Farage to walk in on that debate, because Labour is trying, they would say, to smash the gangs, which is different to stop the boats. But it's not front and centre in the public's mind that the government is taking strong action on immigration of all flavours.
And I was really struck in one of the last PMQs exchanges, Prime Minister's Questions exchanges, before Christmas, where you had Kemi Badenoch asking a series of questions of Keir Starmer about immigration. I was imagining, if you were Nigel Farage listening to that, you're thinking, here are two parties talking to each other, where you can point to evidence that neither have been successful against their own metrics.
And they're raising the issue that he wants to talk about.
And they're raising the very issue that he would like to talk about, which is just an insight into where politics could go in 2025, and particularly the influence and concern that all of the parties, particularly the big two at Westminster, have about the rise of reform.
Do you have vivid memories of the Tory leadership contest?
Oh.
Well,
do you know, funnily enough, I've got more vivid memories of the shadow Tory leadership contest. So I've got very clear memory of when Robert Jenrick resigned and arrived in our studio a few days later, haircut, new suit, and everyone thought, oh yeah, I know what's going on here. Equally, an interview when Suella Braverman came out after the local elections and said, this is basically, we are heading for disaster. And, you know, her backers would say very courageously, was saying things out loud that other people wouldn't say. The actual contest itself, I think, was not, you know, massively inspiring. I don't think for the people involved. And I think they've ended up in a situation where not everybody, and, you know, let's be clear, Kemi Badenoch has a lot of very ardent, passionate backers who see something in her they think holds enormous promise. As we were chatting on the 12th of December, whenever you're listening to this newscasters, sorry, the 13th of December.
Good transparency.
There are a lot of people also in Tory circles who think that probably nobody who ran for the Conservative leadership this time around is going to be the next Conservative Prime Minister. Who knows? But I think that's a fair reflection of where a lot of kind of heads are at, is that they're not quite sure where they're going yet.
And also a sense from quite a few privately that they might not have hit the bottom yet. So they look towards next year and the council elections in England coming up in May, which were last fought in 2021, which was a high point for Boris Johnson immediately after the pandemic and all the rest of it. He was kind of flying at the time. So the real fear from plenty of Conservatives is that they could have a really rough time. And the leadership election, which went on for a long time, and the argument was, why not take time? Because you've just lost an election, you're never more irrelevant as an opposition party than when you've just lost big time, so you might as well take your time. But that allowed them to have what political nerds love having, which is a conversation about ideas. And you know, good luck to people indulging in that, because that's what draws people into politics. But it meant that they arguably paused a more reflective moment of thinking, crikey, you know, it's a long old parliament this, and look at our numbers, and look at the reality of opposition. I said this on a newscast a couple of weeks ago, but I bumped into a shadow minister in a restaurant in Westminster who was waiting for somebody else to have lunch with, and they were there with a biro and a blank piece of paper, and I just said, what are you doing? And they said,
working in the restaurant, taking your order.
Said, I'm starting to write a speech. You know, and that idea that you start with a blank piece of paper and a pen, and it is just you,
right?
As opposed to a kind of template from the civil service into which you put some political language and you kick it around in the context of government policy. And they're thinking, well, there isn't really a policy because they're going quite policy light for now, the Conservatives. But they've got to respond to this thing the government's doing tomorrow. And what am I going to write? And there was this person with a pen and a blank piece of paper, and that's really the reality of opposition.
Do you know, there's another three very well connected Conservatives that I was very, very, very interested to hear when they, by chance in separate conversations, all told me that they didn't vote for either of the candidates this time round because they just were like, just not voting.
So,
uninspired was what one of them said. And that's not to cast aspersions on any of the people who were candidates. It was just very interesting to me that people who sort of spent their lives being involved in the party, trying to help the Conservatives win, who in various different guises had been part of the sort of victories of the last few years.
And one of the points of being in those parties is you get to
have a
choose.
say.
Yeah.
Right? They're just like, nah, I don't know, not bothered.
Right, let's talk about Keir Starmer then.
Yes.
When he was sat here in the Newscast studio on his 99th day in office, doing an interview marking his 100th day, he talked about the headwinds he'd been subjected to. Let us count the headwinds of the first few months of the Labour
What you
government.
mean making a complete hash of donations? That's not really a headwind. Those were unforced errors that got into the public domain about accepting freebies and donations and gifts, all
Taylor
within
Swift
the rule.
concerts,
Taylor Swift
glasses.
tickets, glasses, suits, all of those sorts of things, clothes. The Starmers, Rachel Reeves, Angela Rayner, Bridget Phillipson had a donation that she spent partly on a social event. You know, there were a clutch of senior Labour people who were revealed to have taken money for within the rules properly, but spent it on things that most people, I think most newscasters would think, you what? You got money from a political donor to buy yourself a new pair of specs, or, you know, there you are, Chris. I'm sure you paid for your own glasses. And the public were horrified, not just because it's not the kind of thing you might expect your politicians to do, but also because Keir Starmer had basically run on a ticket of, I'm not the sleazy guy. I'm Mr. Rules is one of his nicknames.
Public service.
Public service is running through me. I will have the most accountable government. I will return government to the service of the British people. And Labour didn't handle it well.
went on for. I remember chatting to a
it's
senior
age.
Labour person who said that they had previously been out on a media round where they'd go out in the morning and talk to lots of different TV and radio stations at one particular point, and they'd been asked loads of questions about passes for glasses and all that stuff. And they did another media round 5.5 weeks later and were still being asked about that.
5.5 weeks.
And they were saying, look, so, in the view of this person, the sort of screw-ups went in every direction. Firstly, not seeing this before it happened and recognising how damaging this would be. And then secondly, not dealing with it once it had become public with some sort of attempt to sort of deal with it, and you get it out of the news, and then people talk about other stuff.
And I just remember when Keir Starmer was here and he said that sentence about the side winds. And, we said,
Headwinds and side winds. I mean, that's
headwinds and side winds. Yeah, I mean, multiple wins, as we've now just discussed. Who's had beans? And he said, and we were like, I think it was I can't remember if it was you or me, he said, well, what? Just spell them out. And he went, oh, there was the donation stuff. And then he sort of almost said under his breath, and personnel. What was he getting at with personnel?
Personnel
About
issue.
Sue Gray.
Sue Gray. So Sue Gray was, after a long period of angst in the Labour Party, picked to be, as a former Whitehall type, Keir Starmer's chief of staff. And when she was picked to be Keir Starmer's chief of staff in opposition, there were people at the time who were saying, why would we get somebody to be chief of staff who has basically a target on their back because they are well known and they have a profile for having gone after Boris Johnson? Point one, why would you want to do that? Point two, well, you'd want to do that because she was known as being an experienced Whitehall operator. She can prepare us for government. That will be all marvellous. And Sue will come up with a gazillion ring binders of perfectly worked out, realistic, workable, ready to hit the ground running plans for government.
And knows how the system works and which levers to pull.
Absolutely.
And all that.
Despite never having actually run a big government
spending
department.
which was another point three that people made about, well, actually, if you want a kind of Whitehall machine operator, you don't want Sue. She was different for other things and actually knowing where bodies were buried and looking after propriety and ethics and all those kinds of things. Anyway, they arrive in government, and as we talk about on our soon-to-be-published election newscast, Labour had run things in two very different ways. They had the party machine, who ran a slick, focused, dynamic campaign that almost didn't have anything go wrong. Almost. There were a few things, but was largely very, very effective. There was a different operation, literally going from, the moment the exit poll landed to how they were actually going to run things once they were victorious. Sue Gray was in charge of that bit. The two sides came together when they all moved into Downing Street, and it didn't work. It was like mixing.
Spectacularly didn't. I mean, so when I was tipped off about Sue Gray's salary. Alongside the whole business of the betting stuff during the general election, it was the second moment of my year where my jaw hit the floor. Because it's the sort of thing you expect at the tail end of a government where kind of everyone's falling out with each other. They're thinking about what comes next because they're anticipating defeat. and all that, this kind of stuff. This was like 5 or 6 weeks in.
Well, what's
And it was just, what?
Yeah.
And it was so laser guided because it was so specific. It wasn't deniable. There was enough. I was given enough facts that it was going to.
It was either true or it wasn't.
Exactly. It wasn't. It wasn't vague.
No.
It wasn't. You couldn't duck and dive as you so often can with little tidbits that.
And the
that you pick
story
up.
was that after weeks of like unhappy briefings about clashes and how Sue Gray was acting towards some long-time political aides, and then some briefing from people who were on her side saying she was being sort of targeted by the lads, and it was like oil and water; it wasn't mixing.
Yeah.
But your story that was leaked and absolutely true was that she was being paid more than the Prime Minister.
Yeah, and that wasn't.
That was your jaw dropper moment.
Yeah, she was being paid more than the Prime Minister. Now, to be clear, there are plenty of people in Whitehall who earn that kind of money and more, and her salary would, in time, have been published. But the fact is, it was an act designed to try and get her out the door.
Yeah, it's sabotage, right?
Exactly, and it
and
was
as much to make Keir Starmer realise he had to get rid of her rather than create public pressure to get rid of her.
Yes.
Exactly. Well, the only there was 3 solutions to this, one of which wasn't a goer. So solution 1 was you get that she goes. Solution 2 is you get rid of those who want rid of her, but there was a lot of them. Solution 3 is that you deal with the issue that's causing all of this. That wasn't going to happen to a degree that would please both sides. And so you had this then playing out publicly. I remember talking to the Prime Minister in New York just a day after the Labour conference, where all of this was still rumbling. She hadn't gone to the Labour conference, having been there the year before. And I asked him, and he said he acknowledged how difficult it was that this was now playing out in public. And of course, we fast forward a few weeks, and on a Sunday lunchtime,
and they were tricksy because they announced it about 2 hours after all the Sunday morning programmes had finished.
Yes.
And I was talking to somebody on the
1.
way home.
Yeah.
I was like, something's going on. Is it soon? They're like, you'll know before too long. I was like, obviously she's leaving, but they were very tricksy. Put out something on a Sunday.
I stepped back through the front door, having taken my kids swimming, and someone texted me. I thought, oh, hang on.
See you later. Bye, everybody.
Exactly that. Exactly
Still
that.
at the swimming pool.
I don't miss that feeling.
I'm just going to pick them up. That was that. And then the arc was completed because the kind of mutually convenient lay-by into which Sue Gray was kind of moved, which is this idea of being an envoy to the nations and regions, an event that was happening. There was an event along those exact lines happening a few days later, which she wasn't at. Fast forward a few weeks, and she was not doing that.
You can't give someone a made-up job, and then it just had that smell about it. This was a kind of made-up way out. But the reason, as you were alluding to, Chris, the reason it was all important is that it was just an incredible sign of dysfunction.
Instantly, at the heart of government.
But it did give us a classic LK on a train episode of Newscast.
Oh, well, they were always grateful for one of them. Oh, yeah, I forgot. You see, I wasn't. And then I found from the train, like with a scarf over my head in the toilet. It's all glamour. Glamour.
Whilst we're indulging in this sort of inner workings, but of course it matters, because it matters whether the team around a Prime Minister will, A, get on, B, can work together in a functional way, and then C, can deliver on whatever it is the Prime Minister wants to do. And what happened after that is that Morgan McSweeney, who was seen as the sort of mastermind of Labour's election campaign, has become has become the chief of staff. They brought in several other figures. Somebody said to me the other day, we finally got beyond the point where the political wing of the civil service, which was a critique of a sense that, this goes beyond just the Sue Gray thing, but they overlap, a sense that the new government sort of hit the ground stumbling, unforced errors, the timing of the announcement of the winter fuel cut, or even the winter fuel cut full stop, but the timing of all of that, and the sense, and I've heard this from so many people, of things that were put in front of new ministers by the civil service that new ministers were not sufficiently sceptical about, and then just signed up to.
But they had all those amazing plans, so they kept telling us how well planned they were beforehand, before the election.
But the fact that Keir Starmer's now gone from having as his sort of right-hand person, Sue Gray, to doing a speech a few weeks ago where the standout line was, too many people in Whitehall are happy with sitting in the tepid bath of managed national decline.
And then the day after, he had to start apologising
to civil servants,
I mean, I think what's interesting about that is that from speaking to sort of lots of senior folk in the last few weeks of the year, I think that is his authentic view, and that has solidified in the 5-6 months that he's been in office.
Yeah, it's genuine frustrated.
Yeah, genuine frustration. But that is separate from how you then go about making a public argument and the extent to which you might want to sort of build up to it more slowly as opposed to just dropping it into that switch with very arresting and very quotable language. And before you know it, you've got Dave Penman, who's the union leader for senior civil servants, coming out publicly and saying loads of my members are furious. And these are the guys, whatever the failures of personnel or structures, who've got to deliver your programme.
And that's genuine, right? There were people inside government who were absolutely hopping mad about it, who then thought, and Paddy and I talked about it last weekend, that, you know, that frustration and that anger on the kind of Starmer wing is absolutely real. But there are people who are like, hang on a minute, we've been getting on trying to make this work. New ministers are getting their feet under the desk. We're starting to get things working. So why now would you start kicking people in public? And there's an interesting thing about it is that I think some people think, well, there's been an awful lot of there's been quite a lot of blame culture from this iteration of administration, first of all. And first of all, it was you pointing the finger at Sue Gray. Now you're pointing the finger at the civil service. It's very, very early in a new government to be going for this. This is a government that should be all-conquering, able to sweep all before them. They've got a massive majority. They had ages knowing that they were very, very likely to be in power. It is surprising, I think, that we're already in a phase where they're going, well, this is really hard and it's because of that, and this is really hard because it's that. And it's sort of...
It felt like various moments that you might expect over a 4 or 5 year term have been happening on fast forward in the first 5-6 months.
And that's life now. But there's something else that stuck in my mind from a few weeks ago. Somebody who's working with the new government said to me, it's like they've forgotten the joy. And this is a hard time in governing in the 2020s is very difficult, and people feel skint and cross and angry and all the rest. But just that line stuck with me. I thought that's really, in all sorts of contexts, that's an interesting thing. It's like, this is really hard, and let's tell you how hard it is.
Well, the flip side of that then is self-pity, which is not an attractive thing electorally to the public.
It's so true. We were talking earlier about the Conservative leadership race and their conference, where they were sort of indulging in a certain joy, really, of going through the process of electing a new leader. The Labour conference, it's exactly that point, Laura, about joy. The weight of government, you could feel the weight of government on their shoulders. Now, as a newscaster, you might think too right too, because it's a big old responsibility and you should take it seriously, and of course they do. But that sense of the weight of it is just there in a way that often leads to sort of kind of a glum demeanour.
We should talk about the riots that happened in the wake of the killings at the Taylor Swift dance class in Southport, and that felt like one of those moments that we get in the country every 10 years or so, where it feels like the society's kind of a bit on the edge.
And it's one of the episodes actually where the government, I think, has a good argument to say we got out there, they handled it effectively, they ramped up a very public crackdown on the criminality that people were seeing. I think there are all sorts of unresolved sort of societal, emotional identity questions about what happened beyond that hideous criminality. And of course, there's a legal case around the particular horror of what actually happened to those little children who had gone to have a nice time. But actually for the government, early doors, it was a moment when Starmer actually was obviously straining every sinew to do it, but did manage to convey a real sense of authority and look like he was in charge. And some people in government would say actually that has been his kind of, in terrible circumstances, that has been that was a positive moment for him where he could flex his particular expertise, if you like, too, as you know, I was the chief prosecutor and I'm going to bang these people up, even though, of course, technically there's a separation between our police and our politicians and the judiciary. However, the sort of projection of I'm not having this and these people are going behind bars was a politically speaking, it was a kind of good moment for him in some ways, which could have worked out so much to the negative. I mean, it could have been a terrible moment for a new government. It could have looked like they were flailing, and actually they didn't.
There was a curious symmetry of his biography and the timeline of moments of riot and unrest from his time as chief prosecutor, which I notice now is the label he uses is for his time as director of public prosecutions. They've found a more human way,
sexier,
and it sounds, I don't know, tougher and all of that. But it took them several years to latch onto that description of that particular job. But first, rewind to the to the riots of a decade or so ago, and of course he was in that role, so he saw those two outbreaks of really grim violence, decade or so apart, in the two sort of principal roles, if you like, top of government and chief prosecutor, and. Yeah, I mean, those in government do say exactly that. They feel that that was a moment that they did show grip. But at the same time, and this sounds trivial in the context of all of the specific issues around Southport and then the wider societal issues posed by it, for a new government, it also meant that in their first month or so, they didn't have the space to do some of the stuff that they might have chosen to do, or just working out how to do the whole business of government. And somebody else said to me quite recently, just in a practical sense, but remember, these are human beings at the top of government, just as they are any other organisation. They didn't have any chance to stop, to pause. Summer kind of went because they were dealing with that crisis, as you'd expect a government to do. And then, of course, on you go with everything else.
And many politicians and leaders have learned you don't necessarily get credit from the public for dampening down a crisis and stopping it getting worse.
No, well, that's right. I mean, voters, it's a kind of old adage, isn't it? It's voters aren't grateful. And why should they be, right? You know, but voters you don't get credit in the bank for doing something well necessarily. And at that time, it was so they went basically straight into a very hot, immediate crisis, when they maybe should have been getting their heads around what the budget was going to be, which was an absolute mega, huge, giant budget that set the tram lines for the years ahead. You know, the government, as we record, you know, middle of December, the government's number one on its list is meant to be growth, and actually the economy shrank, the latest figures suggest. So that is all very troublesome. And the budget, while it didn't explode into tiny little shards, it certainly set off lots and lots and lots of problems. And it was not the sort of convincing sweep of a pro-business, pro-growth, wow, let's put rocket boosters under the economy. It was a much more sort of traditional bread and butter labour schools and hospitals type of budget that put taxes up in a way that a lot of people are very, very unhappy about in the business world.
And where the conversation is still continuing as we tilt into the new year, whether it be the farmers protesting just before Christmas again in Westminster with a whole gazillion tractors making their way down Whitehall, that whole winter fuel thing, the winter fuel payment.
Oh yeah, we haven't even mentioned that.
Yeah, I mean, so I remember just before I was about to have a bit of a rest in the summer, and I was a bit knackered after the election. There was suddenly, there's a news conference at the Treasury. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor's going to be saying something, blah, blah, blah. Okay, all right, we'll go along. And out of nowhere came this huge policy shift affecting millions of people, many of whom would not regard themselves as well off, with the scrapping of the winter fuel payment for a shed load of millions and millions of pensioners. A decision coming in isolation. Now, the argument the government makes was that they were convinced that they had to make so-called in-year cuts, that they couldn't wait for a budget several months or a couple of months down the track. But in political and news terms, it meant this thing came that affected millions. It was out of nowhere. They hadn't really built up much of an argument prior to it happening. It wasn't coming on the day of a budget where you can point to other stuff where you might say, "Oh, yes, we're doing that," but actually look at that. That's a good, quote unquote, good thing, as some people might see it. And it's still making headlines 6-7 months
later. And also
later.
from a person who said, I'm going to do things in a very proper, thought-out way. You won't be getting things done on a whim. We're public servants through and through, going to get the OBR to cost everything, and then you got that. Right, we're running out of time. Normally, in a normal news programme, we'd say, let's make some predictions for 2025. I know you two don't like doing that, so I'll make one, which is that there'll be many more episodes of Newscast, including a very special one, marking the 5th birthday of us becoming a daily news podcast, having originally been almost everyday podcast with Brexitcast.
Any excuse
5 years of Newscast.
When do we reach that landmark, pivotal, historic moment?
February 25th.
Oh, is it? Oh, right.
Yeah, exactly. I haven't sent out that meeting request yet.
I'm just as much as we look forward to that celebration of joy with all our wonderful newscasters who listen and put up with us all year round, there is so much else this year that we could and should have talked about.
Course,
the Greens and the Lib Dems and the SNP and what's happened in Northern Ireland and like a gazillion other things. And never fear, Donald Trump, there will be plenty of that in Newscast to come. So that's the only reason I crowbar that in. So if you're cross that there's things we didn't mention, sorry, but surely in all the episodes we've wanged on about in the last year, we mentioned it somewhere along the way.
Oh, and also if there's things you want us to look at in 2025,
tell us.
Emails are always open, newscast@bbc.co.uk, or you can WhatsApp us on 0330 123 9480, or you could just hang out with us every day in 2025.
2024, the year where Adam learnt the number convincingly and could just deliver it without hesitation.
I haven't learned ours on a Sunday morning yet.
No, I
I'm like,
couldn't do it.
8,000. I don't know. Give up. It's on the screen.
Isn't that Anna Deck? Let's get on Saturday Night Takeaway. Right, we're going to take ourselves away. Bye.
We say Happy Christmas.
Or whatever festival you're celebrating, yeah?
Happy holidays.
Happy New Year. And Christmas.